In the last episode, we talked about amazing emulation on the Xbox Series S and introduced developer mode, a feature that was added to the Xbox One line of consoles in 2016 and brought forward to the Xbox Series S and Series X. Dev mode is the ability to install development builds of software that utilize UWP or the Universal Windows Platform. This would also include emulators such as RetroArch. We saw impressive performance on the Xbox Series S with a development build of RetroArch, and the standouts for me was Nintendo GameCube, which ran at a level of performance that's unrivaled at a $299 price point. We also hinted that RetroArch was working on incorporating the PlayStation 2 emulator, PCSX2, in a future update, and it was something I was planning on covering maybe in a few months or so. Well, things have moved a lot faster than anticipated. Preview builds of RetroArch are already available that have PCSX2 implemented and are already out there, with some users already testing out PS2 on the Xbox Series S and Series X. So let's jump in and take a look at PlayStation 2 on the Xbox Series S. The first thing to note is that PCSX2 in RetroArch is currently still very much in active development, and the builds that are out there have some bugs, lots of them in fact. It took me quite some time to get things set up, and to be totally honest, I was almost thinking about giving up and just waiting for a later time when things were more stable. But there are some interesting things to talk about here, but I do want to stress the bugs. The biggest one is that in dev mode, PCSX2 under RetroArch is currently limited to 2GB or smaller in ROM sizes, which limits the games that you can play. There is a workaround to run RetroArch in retail mode. However, this is something that we will not be covering in this episode, as there are questions around the legalities of this. But the takeaway here is, PS2 on the Series S is definitely not a set it and forget it, but I do want to demonstrate the potential here, that a Microsoft console for the first time can emulate a Sony PlayStation 2 for $299. On paper, that's pretty impressive stuff. So then, how does the Xbox Series S handle PlayStation 2 emulation with PCSX2? The answer is very well. Not perfect, but the positives outweigh the negatives, and the emulation is already shaping up to be very impressive and will only improve over time. As usual, I tested a whole slew of games, and every capture you'll see is directly coming out of the Series S with no post-processing or any other additions. What you see here is what you will get. It's never easy to know where to begin, so let's start with the heavy hitters. Konami's Metal Gear Solid 2. It runs, and it runs very well. The occasional hiccup or texture issue here and there, but offers a great experience, especially on the Xbox gamepad that maps to the PS2's controller almost one-to-one. Jak and Daxter was another title that ran pretty well, although this one did have more slowdowns in parts of the game as well as more texture issues. PCSX2 has a high level of compatibility, but it also does have quite a few issues as well. Unfortunately, some of these will translate over to the RetroArch build that you'll see on the Xbox Series S. Over in Japan, publisher Atlus released a few cave bullet hell shoot 'em up games, and I was eager to test them out. I tested a few and all of them worked, with various levels of compatibility. Dodonpachi DOJ ran great, almost flawlessly, while Espgaluda ran very well, but it did have noticeable texture issues, as you can see. Next up, I tested Eco, one of my favourite games on the PS2, a true classic, and a game that I desperately would love to see a remake for. Bluepoint Games, if you're watching this, please give us a remake. Anyway, the game runs great. I didn't notice any issues here at all. In fact, I would say this is one of the better emulated games that I've seen so far running on the Xbox Series S. It kept a smooth and steady frame rate throughout as well. Another game I tested was Ace Combat 4. This ran very well, maintaining a solid frame rate, but it did have some texture issues, notably the sun texture. Otherwise, it was perfect. Another game that I absolutely love on the PS2. I also tested, of course, God of War, which ran great. It did have some minor texture issues, but held up its frame rate almost 99% of the time. Certainly no complaints here at all. One of my favourite games is Time Splitters 2. It runs near flawlessly on the Series S. It's silky smooth, and the game still holds up. It's worth noting that it also ran very well under GameCube emulation with Dolphin. So really, it's a matter of preference on what version that you want to play. I personally would go with the PS2 version, but it's great to know that you can indeed play Time Splitters 2 on a modern console in 2020 and beyond. Shadow of the Colossus was an interesting one. 85 to 90% of the time, it ran really well, but would every so often show dips and slowdowns. This is a pretty intensive game that pushed the PS2 to its limits, so I'm not too surprised at the slowdowns. It's still gorgeous though, it holds up, and it plays mostly very well. I will say that I'm interested to see if the Xbox Series X would offer better performance with this game and maybe smooth out those areas, but I'll get to a discussion on the Series X later in this episode. Some games I did expect to lock at 60 didn't even come close. Outrun 2006 was unfortunately one of them. Quite disappointing. I certainly expected better here, but hopefully we'll get to see some more optimizations being done. Another heavy hitter undoubtedly has to be Silent Hill 2, and wow, this one is almost near flawless. The cutscenes run at 60 FPS as they should, the fog is properly implemented, and everything runs great other than James's face texture, which is a little off, but I can certainly live with this. Silent Hill 2 is up there with one of my favourite games of all time, and I'm thrilled to see it running on the Xbox Series S and not have to resort to the HD remaster of the game that was quite subpar. The PS2 version has always been the definitive version, and I'm happy to see it running this well. If there's one game that really pushes the PS2 hardware to the limit, it is Gran Turismo 4. Once again, it ran mostly well on the Xbox Series S, but nowhere near full speed. There are frequent frame drops, stutters, and as you can hear, the soundtrack is a bit of a choppy mess. It's close, but it's not there yet. With some optimizations to PC SX2 on the UWP build, we will hopefully see this one improve over time. One game that really surprised me was Maximo by Capcom. Considered to be the 3D spiritual successor to Ghosts and Goblins, it's terrific. The original game is great, and it retains the difficulty of the series. This one is near perfect emulation, running on the Xbox Series S. I had tons of fun revisiting this game, which still looks great. This is definitely one of the better emulated titles that is available with PS2 emulation. Okami by Clover Studios and published by Capcom is a classic on the PS2, and it looks, sounds and plays great. This is another top tier title that is emulated very well. God Hand, another game by Clover, runs near perfect. This game was misunderstood at the time of launch in North America, but it is a cult classic and considered one of the best PS2 titles around. It was originally a part of the PS2 classics on the PS3, but sadly was removed and never made its way to the PS4 and beyond. God Hand is also a very expensive game to buy these days, and it's definitely worth a look if you like beat 'em ups. A few more to round up. Burnout 3 runs great, except for some reason that the skybox textures are completely missing. I'm guessing this is a long-standing PC SX2 issue. Still, the gameplay experience, the speed and everything is intact, all except that texture issue, which doesn't really seem to be a big deal. One of the most expensive to buy PS2 games has to be Rule of Rose, a survival horror game that was developed by Punchline and published by Atlas in 2006. If you didn't want to spend the hundreds of dollars picking up the game, Or maybe you did but wanted to try before you buyed. I'm happy to report on the Xbox Series S it runs exceptionally well. No issues whatsoever. And the last one I tested was Castlevania Curse of Darkness. It's the second 3D Castlevania title for the PlayStation 2 and was released back in 2005. At the time, the game was given mixed reviews, but since then, it's garnered a cult following with some pretty impressive gameplay and very good graphics. I'm happy to report once again on the PS2 emulation running on the Xbox Series S. It runs great. With no noticeable slowdown, no quirks, no texture issues, the sound, the graphics and the gameplay all run as you would expect. So overall, I'm very impressed with what I've seen so far. It is apparent that PC SX2 has its issues over, say, Dolphin. The overall compatibility rate sits at around 90%, and finding a game that runs perfectly can be harder to find. Still, the PS2 library is vast, and I wasn't able to test everything. I am generally very excited to see PS2 running on the Xbox Series S. If you think about it, outside of PlayStation, this is the first time that PS2 games are running on a console system. And I did say this last time, but let me reiterate, the $299 Xbox Series S simply cannot be beaten at that price point with the amount of power that you get. There was a few other things that I wanted to mention that came up in the last episode. The biggest question was, will the Xbox Series X offer faster performance? Now keep in mind that I do not have an Xbox Series X to test any comparisons with, but generally speaking, the answer will be no. Most emulators rely on fast CPU performance with dynamic recompilers and are mostly CPU bound. The CPU found in the Xbox Series X as compared to the Xbox Series S are quite similar in terms of performance. However, the Series X will still outperform the Series S, where GPU and memory bandwidth might become a factor. For things like post-processing shaders or heavier GPU scenes, the Series X will definitely perform better. But in 99% of cases, I would expect little to no change between the Xbox Series S and the Xbox Series X. So in conclusion, with the focus on RetroArch running on Xbox hardware, where do we go from here? Well, I do expect to see constant updates and improvements made, and as long as Microsoft supports developer mode, fans of Xbox and emulation will have a compelling reason to spend that $20, activate developer mode, load up on your favorite Sega Dreamcast, Nintendo GameCube, Nintendo Wii, and now for the first time Sony PlayStation 2 games, and have an overall great experience. So there you have it, PlayStation 2 on the Xbox Series S. Pretty incredible stuff, and I'm definitely going to continue to follow this story for you guys because this is still very much in the early phases of development. But let me know what you thought about this in the comments below. What do you think about a $299 system that is pretty much smoking the competition as far as emulation devices? And I'm talking about things like the Atari VCS, the Poly Mega. The Xbox Series S just comes in and really just sets a new benchmark in what to expect from emulation at that price point. And I am continuing to be very impressed with what I'm seeing. And like I said, I'm going to continue following the story for you guys because I think there is a lot more to come here, and we're going to see a lot more surprises coming out of the developer mode or the dev mode for the Xbox Series S. Well, I'm going to leave it here for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked this episode, leave me a thumbs up, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Bye for now.